Hello and welcome to AQA GCSE Sociology. This video is all about what to do if you get a question on class. Now, the first thing to think about is what class actually is. In terms of most people's view, it's wealth. How much money you have decides how far up the class system you are. Now, that's a little bit more complicated than that. And if you look at the evolution of ideas about class, we go back to Marx, for example, and the idea there are only really two classes, and Weber coming along and disagreeing with that and adjusting it slightly down to recent ideas around 7 classes. You may want to think about what actually is it that I'm talking about when I'm talking about social class. So the traditional British view, if you like, usually is upper, middle and lower class, and you may remember the old comedy sketch I showed you reflecting this, which is pictured here. And obviously that disagrees with Marx considerably. And it mixes in the idea that yes, money is important, but it's also about how you dress, how you talk, what job you do. And that links more to status as well. So it's a division based on social and economic status. The economic status is important, how much money you have, but the social status, how people perceive you and how you perceive yourself, is really key here. Because some people will belong to a class group but perceive themselves as much higher or lower. And there's an idea in sociology, well, is that a negotiated label? Is it about actually how society sees us more than how you see yourself? And does that influence how you dress, how you talk, how you behave? So you may want to think of real life examples there to help you out. So whenever you're talking about class, remember it's more than just money. It's about identity and where that identity fits in the rest of society too. Research in sociology and class is a really interesting idea. If you get a question on some form of research in class, a 4-marker for example, how would you measure some element of class? Obviously you want to think about the method that you use, and you want to remember the fact that class can be compared to a lot of other things. So people will define their own class, or you will have to define class for yourself as a researcher. So would you set a government standard such as the poverty line? And therefore there are a lot of problems with measuring class, because if you just use wealth, you're not taking into account the social factors. And if you talk to individuals and just take into account their own perception, their own social factors, you might not get a good handle on how wealthy they are. So researching class could be quite difficult. So you may get a question on it. It would be very nasty of the examiners to be too specific if they're talking about class and research, in my opinion. But can we measure class accurately? In my opinion would be no, you can't. There's the kind of best guess, best fit approach. And if you think about the methodology of a lot of research, so functionists, for example, they're talking about meritocracy and social mobility, where they use a lot of secondary data. So there's issues there, isn't there? Where did this data come from? How accurate is it? How do they link it to their own ideas of class? Feminists, not so interested in class, whereas Marxists are, but again, conflict sociologists using a lot more hands-on methods, if you like, where they're getting a lot more valid data with observation and face-to-face surveys and things like that. So the studies that revolve around class, you can see how actually the gathering of data there too is something you may want to consider. So when you're talking about class, what did that researcher mean by class? Well, that could be very different based on era, based on country, based on lots of different factors as well. So make sure you consider that. I would keep it very simple and keep it very much in the idea of, well, Marxists are going to think of proletariat and bourgeoisie, generally speaking. Feminists and functionists are probably going to think very contemporary and very traditional, upper, middle, lower class, working class maybe. The terminology you want to use, middle class too. So don't get too bogged down and worry too much about the details of research and class here, I would say. Families and class is quite a controversial concept. So if you're talking about that in your exam, you want to be very wary about generalizations, as with anything else. Is there a link between family type and class? Difficult to say. There's an argument that middle class and upwards are more likely to be traditional nuclear families. But obviously there's lots of different exceptions to that, and it's very difficult to stereotype. you may want to ask yourself something about how changes to family type could then inform class. So a divorce is very expensive. So are you likely to get more lower or working class reconstituted and blended families because of the loss of wealth and the changes in wealth? That's something you may want to consider. But if you're very, very wealthy and you've married into it, are you going to try and stay with that person? I know the risk of sounding very cynical. I don't mean to. Likewise, homosexual families. Homosexuals who go through IVF, surrogacy, even adoption, they may be wealthier, they may be higher class, middle class and above. So that may skew the figures in terms of family type. Very tricky for you to say that in the scope of GCSE, so I would hope if you get a question on that, it will be very basic and very general. The questions around class affecting how we experience family life, that's far more likely to come up. And that's a lot easier to talk about because you have norms and values, you have socialization, and you have the whole life cycle diversity and the experience of being a class or being within a social class and social mobility and what that does to your family. So if you look at the question from the past paper, families remain an important agency of socialization. To me, that's a question of class. Does your family ensure you stay in the same class as Marxists would argue? Does it ensure that you have social mobility as functionists would argue, or not? So if you look at my own personal experience, my parents were very working class. I am arguably middle class because of my education, because of my job. So within the 20th century, way after Marx was writing, perhaps things have changed. My family, was I socialized to work hard at school and go on and achieve in that, then meant I had social mobility automatically. Some people would say yes. Some people would argue no, there's more to it than that. In terms of class and family, though, think of norms, think of consumerism as well, Marxism. What can a middle class family do and buy? What kind of things will they own? What kind of house will they live in compared to a working class family? If the male goes out and has a very, very well paid job, does the wife stay at home? Does she do other things? You may see upper and middle class families where the woman is stereotypically may not even do the housework because they have a cleaner, for example. So she may have a social circle outside of that. Whereas a working class mother may be expected to have the dual burden and go to work and be the caregiver and do all of the housework. Now, it's very difficult not to talk in very stereotypical terms and very derogatory terms, perhaps. So you might want to consider that when writing an essay. But class is a really, really good way in families to link to gender and expectations. So I would suggest you do that. Education and class is a really interesting topic, and it's one where you will have lots and lots to talk about. So how does class affect access to education? Well, that's fairly straightforward. The higher classes tend to go to private school because they have the money to pay for them, and private schools tend to offer a service where they guarantee results. So that immediately links into achievement in education. So there is real demonstrable evidence that the wealthier you are, the higher class you are, the better you do in education. And that's not just money, as class never is. If you have middle class parents who not only can afford books but have been well educated themselves, they can show a child how to do well at school, how to pass the tests, how to access knowledge. And the graph on the right shows that the higher up the social scale your parents are, the better you tend to do at passing exams. So the higher the pass rate, the higher the class of parent, if you like. If you compare that to facilities, particularly in other countries which are very poor, and the facilities that you have in this country, even for a bog standard school, if you like, there's a massive difference there. And how education is valued by the classes. So in terms of norms and values, particularly the perception around education is really important. If your parents want you to be better educated and want you to do well at school to have success, that can be a huge factor. So if you look at the question from the previous papers about pupils' social class being the most important factor for educational success, there's a lot to argue that yes, it is the most important factor, but that's because you can break it down into lots of things. The money to access better education, the norms and values of success, the expectation. if your parents are paying thousands of pounds a year for you to go to school, that may pressure you to do better at school. It may have the opposite effect, there's always exceptions. But if you think about the studies, such as Willis particularly, or Ball and parentocracies and marketisation and things like that, regardless of the viewpoint of the sociologist, the findings tend to show there's a link between class and educational success, and that's down to what involvement parents have and what involvement the kids then have in their own education, their own destiny. So if you get a question like this, it's really nice because there's a lot you can explore. And I would always say, again, pupil social class is something that schools study, academics study. You want to think about things like pupil premium, for example, and the funding that's available to try and lessen that gap. But then there's another gap in society because there's schools that aren't at all worried about that because they're private schools. They're not catering for everyone else. So there's a lot to unpack here and a lot you can talk about, lots of different directions. My advice should be not to talk about it all at once in one essay, but pick and choose and make sure that you focus on the elements of class you're comfortable with and preserve a good argument so that you've got a for and against. Crime and class tends to be an area where students do very well in their responses. That's generally because the understanding of the dark figure and white collar crime versus other types of crime. So really, you may want to think about who does what sort of crime and why. So if you pick up Merton's ideas around status frustration, strain theory, anomie, is it logical that someone who already has wealth, who has power and status, is going to commit petty crime? Well, no, it's not likely. The people who are going to do that are going to be the majority of people who don't fit into that class bracket, as it were. So the types of crime committed by the upper and middle classes are going to be things that they have access to, such as white collar, such as fraud, money laundering, that kind of thing. That's all very straightforward. Obviously, there's then the criminal justice system. Who are the police targeting? What kinds of crime are they targeting? And how do those link? Police obviously are out on the streets more than they're going through the bank accounts of different businesses, so there's something to consider there. There's also who makes up the criminal justice system. Lawyers, judges, they tend to be old, white, middle class and above educated people. That's the vast majority, that's a generalisation. But as with the chivalry thesis and gender, there's an idea perhaps that the class of the people involved, both as offenders if you like, or accused, and those who are judging them and processing the cases, could lead to certain biases and certain convictions and things like that. So you may want to consider that. Then there's the issue of the likelihood to commit crime. If you get that question around, are the working class more likely to commit crime? Well, you need to think about the fact there's far more working class people by number and by proportion. So yes, crime could be anything from something very minor to something very serious, and then there's types of crime. So overwhelmingly, what you're really being asked to do there is to pick out the differences and pick out the details and show the theories. So functionalists would explain that in terms of crime being beneficial, obviously, crime reflecting society's norms and values, and showing where society is perhaps going wrong or breaking down. Marxists will look at it in exploitative means, and the fact there is a vast majority who are without money and wealth and means, and a small minority who have it all, and that's going to cause conflict and cause crime. Feminists is slightly harder to link to, but if you think about Haydn's Zone and the idea of working class women being abandoned, having to fend for themselves, having to bring up children, being let down by men, crime it links very nicely to functionalism in the sense that crime being the only viable option for these women, it is something that's going to happen. So a very general question like working class crime and being different to other social classes is very straightforward, and it allows you to pick and choose where you want to go. I would just caution you against being too specific and think more in general terms perhaps, and show that you understand different perspectives, different studies, and pick a couple of key words around those and show that you can give real life examples, and that will really secure the marks for you here. the social stratification element of your exam, it really is about class essentially. I mean, there's more to it than just class, but class is so fundamental to it, it might seem odd doing a slide on it like this and a section of the video. Really what you need to think about is what class means to different people and why it's defined the way it is. So societies are organised differently, and that's by different classes, generally speaking, who has the wealth, who has the power. So if you think about your caste system, slavery, feudal system into modern day, and then Marxism, proletariat, bourgeoisie, there's all this issue around who has the money, who doesn't, who has the power, who doesn't, where is this inequality coming from? And that's generally what questions will focus on when it comes to essays, perhaps. So you may want to bring in contrast with meritocracy, social mobility, and the change in definition of class. So think about how we started with class being something about how you dress, the job you have, and that becoming a lot more fluid and a lot more complex as time has gone on. There's a lot more choice out there, and that links to postmodernism and things like that. So how you present yourself, how you define yourself is a lot more fluid and up for debate. Therefore your class and your status and your power is too. So ultimately, this can lead to it being a very open question, and sociologists will try and unpick that, and then it comes down to what kind of data is being collected, what are people talking about. So social class and inequality, yes, there are the old arguments about who has the money, but then you could even link it to media and control of information and democracy and things like that. So when you're in the social stratification part of your exam, don't just think money equals class, because there's more to it than that. And for the really high marks, you want to show the subtle differences and unpick really the sociological language of the question and show that you can make comparisons, you can give examples. That will really get you the best marks possible. So yes, there's an inequality in terms of wealth, but also in terms of access to power, access to a voice in society too, and that's something that you may want to explore alongside issues of class if you get a question on it. I hope this video has been informative. I hope it's helped. Again, always, please leave me questions, comments. I'm not trying to cover everything in every video, so if you feel I've missed something, please point that out and let me know, and I'll get back to you specifically. Thank you very much.